had just finished a long weekend getaway, visiting some friends who had moved out to a small town about 3 hours away from home. It had been a good trip filled with laughs and good food, but now, as the road stretched out in front of me, the weariness was starting to hit. I was alone in my car, the only sound the hum of the tires on the pavement and the soft, low music from the radio. It was almost 2 a.m. by the time I hit the highway, and I had about an hour to go before I'd be home. My name is Jack, and I'm usually not one to get spooked easily. I've driven this highway countless times, and it's as familiar as any road could be. But tonight, there was something different about the air. The fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, and the night felt unnaturally quiet. The street lights flickered weakly as I passed under them, and the road felt deserted, almost abandoned. I was getting tired, and the endless stretch of road made it harder to keep my mind focused. I was thinking about everything and nothing when I saw her. At first I thought it was just another trick of the fog, something I could brush off, but as I got closer, my heart sank in my chest. A girl stood on the side of the road, just standing there. Her figure was faint at first, swallowed up by the mist, but as I got closer, I saw her more clearly. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her long hair blowing in the wind. Untamed and wild, she looked lost, confused even. But the most unsettling part was her gaze. She wasn't looking at me, not directly, but her eyes seemed to see right through me. She wasn't looking at the road or the car. Her eyes were distant, as if she was waiting for something or someone. I slowed the car, then stopped. "Hey, are you all right?" I called out through the open window. My voice echoed strangely in the thick night air. She didn't move at first, then she looked at me, a soft, almost sad expression on her face. There was no smile, no thank you for stopping, just a soft acknowledgement. And then, as if by instinct, she nodded slowly, her gaze still distant, unblinking. She didn't say a word. I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't one to pick up hitchhikers, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the eerie silence, or maybe it was the feeling that I wasn't really in control of the situation. But I found myself unlocking the door and saying, "Need a ride?" She nodded again, silently climbing into the passenger seat. I watched her as she slid in, her movements unnervingly smooth, like she wasn't quite real. I didn't know why I didn't just drive off, but before I knew it, the door was closed, and we were driving down the road together. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She hadn't said anything, just stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. Her skin was unnaturally pale, and her hair, tangled as it was, looked almost too perfect for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. She didn't seem to be cold, despite the chill in the air, and her lack of response unnerved me. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation, trying to ignore the mounting discomfort in my chest. She didn't respond. I waited a few more seconds, but when she didn't answer, I tried again. "I'm heading toward the next town. Do you live nearby?" She turned to me then, her eyes meeting mine. Her gaze was intense, but distant, like she was seeing something beyond me. "Home," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic, but somehow off. I frowned. "Home? Where's that?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed vaguely to the road ahead, toward a small, narrow street that turned off the highway. I glanced at it. It looked like nothing more than a dilapidated road, leading nowhere. "Up ahead," she said, her voice a little firmer now. "That's where I live." I wasn't sure if I should feel concerned, but something about her presence kept me from questioning her more. I figured I'd just drop her off at the turn and be done with it. Still, I had a feeling I wasn't going to get a thank you when I dropped her off. We drove for what seemed like forever, the fog thickening, swallowing the car as we left the main highway behind. The further we went, the more isolated the area became. I looked at her again. Still the same expression on her face. It wasn't even an expression, really, just a blankness. "So, what's your name?" I asked, trying to break the silence. I didn't like how her silence seemed to fill the air, but she didn't answer. We turned onto the narrow street she'd pointed to, and soon, a house appeared through the fog. It was an old, run-down house, with boarded-up windows and a dilapidated porch. There was no sign of life, no lights flickering in the windows. It looked like a place that hadn't seen people in decades. "Here," she said simply, and I pulled over to the side of the road. When I turned to look at her, she was gone. I blinked, confused. The seat next to me was empty. The door was still locked, and I was alone. I sat there for a moment, the car idling, wondering if I had somehow imagined the whole thing. I got out of the car and approached the house, but when I looked closely, I saw that the porch was falling apart, and the house was abandoned. There was no sign of anyone having lived there for years. Then, a voice called out from inside the house, "I've been waiting for you." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, my mind racing, but the street was still empty. I turned back to the house and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was her, the girl, but now I could see the truth. Her skin was almost translucent, her eyes sunken and hollow. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the kind of smile a living person gives. It was the kind of smile you see in your worst nightmares. "You were always meant to find me, Jack." I ran back to the car and sped away without looking back. I didn't stop until I was far from that road. When I drove past that stretch of highway again the next day, I looked for the house. It wasn't there. There was only an empty field where the house had been. I did some research after that. I found out that there had been an accident on that stretch of highway many years ago. A young woman had been killed while walking alone at night, hit by a car just a mile from where I had picked her up. Her name was Emily. She had been waiting for someone to stop for her ever since. I drove away from that empty field as fast as I could, my heart still pounding in my chest. The image of the girl, the thing in the doorway, was burned into my mind. Her hollow, lifeless eyes, that smile that didn't belong in the living world. I couldn't escape the feeling that she was still watching me, waiting for me to stop and turn around. I didn't dare to look back. I drove for miles, not stopping until I hit the next town. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. The lights inside the small station were flickering, the fluorescent hum only making the eerie quiet feel heavier. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady beneath me. The air was cold and damp, and the silence pressed in from all sides. I stood there for a moment, trying to ground myself, but the questions kept swirling in my head. What had just happened? Was I losing my mind? I went inside the gas station, hoping to talk to someone, to ground myself in reality again. The clerk behind the counter was an older man, with a grizzled face, his eyes half-lidded as he sorted through some papers. I walked up to him, and as soon as he saw my face, he straightened up. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff. I just had an encounter, a weird one. I picked up a hitchhiker, a woman, but..." My words faltered as I tried to find a way to explain it. It felt wrong. She disappeared, like poof. The clerk's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow a little darker. He cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Where'd you pick her up?" he asked, his tone serious now. I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. About an hour north, right near that old stretch of highway, there's this small abandoned house down the road. I paused, trying to gather my thoughts. She said it was her home, but it didn't look like anyone had lived there in years. The man's eyes widened, and he looked away for a moment, as if he didn't want to acknowledge what I was saying. But then, slowly, he leaned back, the weight of his gaze settling on me. "Don't go near that stretch of road again," he said quietly, his voice filled with a grim warning. "That place is cursed. It's not the first time someone's picked up a hitchhiker like that. There's a story, you know." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "What do you mean? What story?" He glanced around, ensuring no one else was close enough to overhear. His voice dropped to a whisper. "A few decades ago, a girl was hit by a car on that very road. She was out there at night, walking home. But the driver never stopped. No one ever found the driver. She died, alone, and they say she's been waiting for someone to find her ever since." I froze, feeling like I was sinking into the floor. "Is she still out there?" The clerk's eyes darkened. "People say she never left, that she's caught between this world and the next. She'll appear to you, just like she did to you, alone, lost, calling for help, and then she vanishes. But there's something you need to understand, son. If she asks for a ride, it's already too late. You're part of the story now." My pulse quickened. "Part of the story?" The clerk nodded slowly. "Once she chooses you, once she gets in your car, you can't leave until she's ready. She won't stop until she's taken you with her, like all the others before you." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to dismiss him as some old fool who believed in ghost stories, but deep down I knew I couldn't. What I had experienced, the way she had just disappeared, the way she seemed so otherworldly, it wasn't normal. It wasn't a trick of the mind. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. What if I had already sealed my fate? "I don't know if I believe in ghosts," I said, my voice wavering. But after what I saw, the clerk stared at me for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was low, almost sympathetic. "You don't need to believe in them. She'll make you believe when the time comes." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You'll hear her voice again. You'll see her again. And the question is, will you be ready when she calls?" I tried to shake off the feeling that was creeping up on me, but it was no use. I could hear it now, the faint whisper of her voice, calling me from somewhere distant. I hurried back to my car, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The road ahead seemed endless, and the fog still hung thick in the air. I didn't want to believe what the clerk had told me, but part of me wondered if I was already caught in her web. That night, as I drove back home, every turn, every stretch of road felt wrong. The trees that lined the highway seemed to lean in closer, and the headlights barely cut through the mist. I glanced at the empty seat beside me, expecting to see her there, that ghostly figure in white, waiting for me. But I didn't see her. I reached my apartment, shaking, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what to believe anymore, but one thing was certain. I couldn't shake the feeling that the girl, the hitchhiker, was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to return. And when I lay in bed that night, trying to sleep, I couldn't help but hear the soft, faint sound of a voice whispering my name. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, closer. The voice that had once been so soft now filled the room. I didn't answer the endless calls of my name. I just pulled the covers over my head and closed my eyes, praying and hoping that the morning would come. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Sterling Short Stories on YouTube, but only if you dare.